Merhaba, Boğaziçi TV'ye hoş geldiniz. Bugünkü programımızda Onur Haftası etkinlikleri kapsamında Serbest Yazın'ın How Gay Composers Create American Identity isimli söyleşisini sunacağız. Ardından devamında da saat 8'de bu bestelenen kompozların başka çeşitli sanatçılar tarafından konserine denk geleceğiz. Sunacağız. Dilerseniz şimdi Serbest Yazı'nın etkinliğine geçelim.
I'm going to try to play this. Let me know if it sounds okay. Can you hear it?
Yes.
Okay, great. Can you hear it well? Or does it sound like it needs to come through my mic? Is it coming from the actually from the computer audio?
Yes, it was computer audio.
Okay. Okay, good.
I think we can start now. Gibi.
Okay.
This meeting is being recorded.
Yes. Hi everyone. Welcome to our new event. We are starting it today. We are with Nadine Hubs. First of all, thank you for your hubs coming and their time, and also thanks to Bone TV to help us broadcast this event on YouTube. And I want to make an introduce if it's everything's right. Yes.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm starting with who we are. As Serbest Yazın, free literature in English, which cares about and struggles for a democratic and free university environment with the motto that academy does not obey. We are involved in the resistance from an academic framework in order to create an alternative academy, and nowadays we continue to organize open lectures as as part of Pride Month events. In these days, when we are going through processes such as the closure of the LGBTI plus studies club, the detention of our friends who carry rainbow flags, and the opening of an investigation against them, we, as Serbest Yazın or free literature, demonstrate that our existence, colors, and identity are far beyond these, and that our visibility will not be denied in any area of the life. Nor will we be denied in academia with the events we will organize during the month of Pride. Finally, we do not accept we we do not accept the appointment, which is an invasion and disrespect to our rights, culture, and autonomy as legitimate, and we ignore the effort to fade our colors. We continue to exist with all our colors in every field. And today's lecture will be happening with Nadine Hobbs. Nadine Hobbs is a publicly engaged musicologist and cultural historian whose work recasts social perspectives of people marked by sexuality and gender, class, race, and migration. Nathan Hobbs's focus is on popular and classical music of the 20th century to the present, in- including Bernstein and Copeland Thompson Circle, 19, 1970s, 1970s disco, Morrissey, Radiohead, Springsteen, and post-war country, including Dolly Parton, Gretchen Wilson, and David Allen Coe. Uh, there is a two award-winning books, the queer composition of America's sound and rednecks, queers, and country music, and many essays and articles belong to Hobbes. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here today. Thank you so much for your kind invitation. I am really honored to take part in such an important series and brave series, this brave work that your organization is doing. It's an honor for me, and I'm filled with pride to be invited as you make these brave efforts under conditions of suppression. And I hope that my talk today will connect in some clear ways with these themes and these issues that you are dealing with. Even though the composers I'm talking about today were working in the 20th century, I think that the strategies that they created to deal with suppression in their own time are still relevant to us. So if you all are seeing my slide okay? My title slide? Great. My title today for this talk, How Gay Composers Created America's Sound During the Most Homophobic Period in US History. I could have phrased that as a question because it sounds a little bit like a mystery, right? How did they manage to create America's sound during the most homophobic period in US history? And that's the question I'm going to answer today. I have two main answers to that question based on the research that I did in a book called The Queer Composition of America's Sound, which you already mentioned. So two main answers to this question. How did they manage to create America's national sound during the most homophobic period in American history? The first answer might come as something of a surprise. Homophobia. Homophobia was a crucial element in this story. They lived in the most homophobic period in US history. And so what did that do? It caused them to band closely together, just as it has caused your organization to come together, So on this slide, you see the composers I spoke about, or I wrote about in this book, The Queer Composition of America's Sound. Mainly these 7 composers. You can see, well, you can't see this because you don't know when the photographs were taken, but they were an intergenerational group of queer artists. This is one of our strengths as queer people, and has been for a long time. We often are intergenerational in our relationships, our friendships, and our loves. And we're often more intergenerational than straight society is. So Virgil Thompson was the most senior of this group, and he was a full 27 years older than the youngest member of the group, with whom he was very close, Ned Rorem. And the others fell in at different places in between. So these are the composers I'm mainly talking about, and I'm saying that one of the answers to the question, how in the world did they manage to create a national sound during the most homophobic period in the nation's history? One of the answers is homophobia, and I'm saying this caused them to band together closely, and I'm going to talk more about that. The second main element beyond the homophobia is what I would call queer world making. They took that homophobia and worked against it and within it at the same time. And they made their own queer worlds. So as a historian, I should talk a bit about, first of all, homophobia as a 20th century phenomenon. Homophobia was a 20th century phenomenon because homosexuality itself was a 20th century phenomenon, right? Homosexuality was a concept that was invented at the end of the 19th century in Europe. It took a while to make its way across the ocean to the United States, and was basically a 20th century phenomenon in the United States. So now that there was this category that created 2 kinds of human beings, the homosexuals and the heterosexuals, 20th century people with gay desires, gay lives, had to invent themselves as homosexual persons. They had to be the inventors of the homosexual. And these artists also created queer worlds. They created themselves as queer men, and that is the term they used for themselves. And they created queer worlds based on queer love, based on queer desire. And then they had to also come up with an identity. And so in my analysis, they did this through their music, and their music was a reflection of their queerness. So another important part of this story is not to write out their queerness as previous musicologists and historians had always done. Their queerness was not a part of the history, and it was seen as something maybe that they managed to succeed in spite of it. And in my analysis, the queerness is absolutely central. We really cannot understand their music, cannot understand what they did as artists without focusing in on their queerness. It was an element of the construction of their music. So how did that work? They were born into the 20th century. They figured out at some point that they were living queer desires and queer lives, this very easily could have kept them from any success as artists. But in fact, these composers wrote the music that other straight composers had been trying to write already for a couple generations. The United States at this time was struggling to have a cultural identity. After World War I, the United States had emerged victorious with the Axis powers in World War I. The United States had become already the wealthiest nation on Earth, but they still struggled comparing themselves to Europe and finding themselves lacking as a cultural and artistic power. And so the culture watchers in the United States were beating the drums. Where are our great composers? Why are we so far behind the Europeans? When will we finally have a cultural identity to match our other powers? Straight composers were trying for a couple generations. Finally, who answered the call? These gay composers. They were the ones who succeeded in coming up with a music that actually established America's sound for the United States and the rest of the world. And I want to play a little bit of that music now. I think you might recognize some of this music. That hoedown from Copland's 1942 ballet Rodeo. This piece, Fanfare for the Common Man, all of these first pieces are by Aaron Copland, the most famous of this circle. Okay, stop. I played the wrong one. And now a little bit of the Appalachian Spring Suite. Why does that happen? My fault, of course. So that's all Copland. I'll play one more composer, a little bit of Leonard Bernstein, who was especially famous for his musical theater pieces as well as his classical pieces. But you may know West Side Story. This was his first big Broadway musical, On the Town. So those are the two most famous composers from this gay circle. Less famous, but the originator of the sound was Virgil Thomson. And Virgil Thomson got his artistic ideas from the lesbian writer Gertrude Stein. But Virgil Thomson, and here's another part of the story that you would never hear from straight musicology or history. Virgil Thomson was a queen. Virgil Thomson was a pansy. And that was really important because Virgil Thomson couldn't go out in public and speak on the radio the way that his colleague Aaron Copland could and be respected and have the kind of intellectual authority that Aaron Copland did or that Leonard Bernstein did, who not only was straight appearing and masculine, gender normative, but also had a wedding ring. So Virgil Thomson was a very queeny, pansy character. And I think that had something to do with why we know Aaron Copland better. They were all very talented. They were all very hardworking. But if we don't take their queerness and this whole queer history and history of gender oppression as well as sexual oppression into account, we can't really understand this story. Speaking of oppression, here is one of their straight colleagues, the French-born American composer Edgar Varèse, writing in a letter to one of his straight buddies, another composer, American composer, about Copland, showing how jealous they were of his success. And here he's blaming, or he's crediting Copland's success to sort of, filthy queer sexual favors. He says, if you use your ass as a prick garage or your mouth as a night lodging, New York is yours. So this is another thing that straight history has never talked about. They hide this letter. I had straight musicologists suggest to me that I would need to get permission to use this letter from the Yale archives. I don't think I have to get permission just because Edgar Varèse was showing what a homophobe he was. So his homophobia was protected for years by musicology, not talking about it, not revealing it. But you see, it was vicious. And this was the world these gay composers were working within. Samuel Barber was another gay composer who was very successful at this time. The style of his music was different, so I don't put him into the same circle. But here I have a letter he wrote to his mother when he was a 10-year-old boy saying, "I'm sorry to tell you, mother, I'm going to be a composer. I won't be an athlete. Please don't tell me to go play football." So the American culture was such at this time that even a 10-year-old understood that being a composer was a problem. That being a musician, a classical musician, was a gender problem. So classical music was already a somewhat friendly space for men who were not properly masculine. But these composers made it even more of a friendly space. They made it a space of queer world making. And I want to illustrate that in a series of diagrams. I'm going to show here, first of all, the musical relations among these composers. All these lavender lines show you who was friends with whom. You can see that Lenny Bernstein and Mark Blitzstein must have been at least friends, right? Maybe very close friends. You can tell in this photograph the way they're looking at each other and how close they are to each other. So yeah, these two knew each other. Virgil Thomson and Paul Bowles knew each other. Aaron Copland and Paul Bowles knew each other very well and traveled together with about a 17-year, or no, those two had a 10-year age difference. Aaron Copland was also very close with Leonard Bernstein, with whom he had an 18-year age difference, et cetera, et cetera. These guys all knew each other. Now, when I go on to the next diagram, you can see, I'm sorry, they all knew each other musically. They all knew each other musically. And you see that in this picture, Bernstein and Blitzstein are recording together. They recorded pieces together. Aaron Copland was a composition teacher to Paul Bowles, who was 10 years younger than he was. Ned Rorem went every day to Virgil Thomson's New York City apartment and copied out his musical scores for him. And when he was there, the older Thompson would give him lessons in orchestration. So they all knew each other musically. They all had musical relations. Bernstein was most famous as a conductor, and he conducted premieres of Copland's works and Blitzstein's works, et cetera, et cetera. David Diamond was not only a composer, but a violinist, and he played fiddle in the orchestra pit for Lenny Bernstein's musicals. So they knew each other musically. They also knew each other socially. The Green Lines show who was friends with whom. And you see that they were tight-knit. They were a tight-knit group of homosexuals. Now, one more diagram shows you with the orange lines which ones had any sexual connection to the others. And you see that those lines are fairly busy too. And those are just the ones I know about, the ones I was able to dig up in the archives. As you can imagine, there might have been others that didn't survive archivally. I mean, I don't have time to dish all the dirt with who had sex with whom. Unfortunately, we could have another lecture. And we would call that a very open lecture about that. But I can tell you that, for example, Virgil Thomson, who was 27 years older than Ned Rorem and used to have him over to his apartment every day, made a pass at Ned Rorem, who, as you can see, was very beautiful as a young man. And Ned Rorem pretended he was asleep to avoid responding when Virgil Thomson made a pass at him. However, Ned Rorem, the first time he met Leonard Bernstein, they hooked up. They never hooked up again, but they hooked up the first time they met, et cetera, et cetera. Aaron Copland was absolutely in love with Paul Bowles, but Paul Bowles, who was also quite beautiful as a young man, just teased him to no end and never gave it up. So there are stories here. Why do I mention them? Why, as a historian, do I mention them? Just because I love to gossip? Well, sure, I love to gossip. Who doesn't? Gay gossip is what we do. But historically, is that important? I hope you'll have some thoughts on that in the Q&A. Is it important that these composers, in their gay world making, in their success in creating an American national sound, had relations, networking in all these different dimensions? It was also important because that was one of the ways that this history was kept silent. You see this in the letter from that pig, Varese, that homophobe, Varese. You see, he's saying that just because they're gay, and maybe there were rumors about Copland being in love with Bowles or Rorem and Bernstein hooking up, but he's trying to insinuate, or he's coming right out and saying that they didn't really have the talent or the hard work to deserve their success, but that they were just fucking each other in order to have influence and power, right? So that totally discredits these networks that made them not just strong individually, but as a collective, a gay collective specifically. Maybe you heard the old 1970s and 80s lesbian saying, an army of ex-lovers can never fail. You know, it's powerful. Queer networks are powerful. When, yeah, folks maybe have slept with each other, they also share their talents. They share their musical skills. They teach one another. They conduct each other's works. They perform each other's music. They help promote each other. And what happens when straight people do that? We call it support. We call it networking. We respect it. But because it was gay in a homophobic time, that was discredited. And if you were an ally or a friend or a queer person, you kept that on the down low. You kept that very quiet. The fact that these gay networks were so rich on all these different levels was a source of their strength, and it was something that had to be kept quiet because it discredited them in a homophobic world. So, how did they do this queer world making? Here's another place where we see their talent and their creativity. They found ways in a hostile, homophobic period not only to succeed as queer artists, but to make their art as queers. So there were certain musical sounds at the time that sounded straight and that sounded gay. Certain kinds of music that sounded butch and sounded femme. And as you might imagine, someone like Virgil Thompson, the Queen, he didn't want to compose butch music. He didn't want to compose the music like Varese composed, that was noisy and boisterous and announced, I'm a real man. He hated that shit. He really hated it. He had to create a music that he could love, that his friends could love, that spoke from his heart and who he was. How did they manage to do it? I give Virgil Thompson primary credit for coming up with the language, even though other people became more famous with it, especially Aaron Copland. But here's how he did it. In a world that insisted on binaries, you were either hetero or you were homo. Sounds had meanings. So dissonant, clangy, noisy music was considered straight and butch and masculine. Pretty music, consonant music, tonal music was considered feminine and came to be considered and understood in insider circles among the cognoscenti, right? Came to be understood as gay, which is why I'm putting lavender on that side. So atonality was heard as straight and masculine and had intellectual authority and power in this time. Nevertheless, Virgil Thompson, he was one of those really brave, fearless queens. He composed pretty tonal music in that time. Stylistic complexity, right? Some of you know the music of Schoenberg. Complex music had authority. It had masculinity. It had intellectual power. Virgil Thompson had the guts, had the courage to compose pretty and simple music. That music I played by Copland, one of the features that's most striking is how lean and simple the music is. And at this time, all of these qualities were associated with German music. These other qualities, were associated with French music, and these composers went to Paris and studied with the great female composition teacher, Nadia Boulanger. So what it all comes down to is these qualities were heard as masculine and bold and modern. These other qualities were heard as feminine. They came to be heard as gay. They were heard as gentle, and therefore they were heard as homosexual. And yet, this music became America's national sound. I can play a little bit more music here to give you a sense of the Frenchness of the sound. There's no more French sounding music composed by this gay circle of Americans than that of Paul Bowles. Here he is looking very looking very gay with his cat and his paisley lounge robe and his cigarette holder. Trust me, there's no cigarette in that cigarette holder. He only smoked hashish. So, with that sound of Frenchness by an American gay composer, I just want to summarize and conclude, and then I would love to talk with all of you here. So, in answer to my question, how did gay composers manage in the most homophobic period in the US history? Sorry, let me find the right slide. How did gay composers manage to create America's national sound? I said, first of all, ironically, it was a result of homophobia, bringing them together very closely. But then with their creativity, with their talent, with their, I have to say too, maleness and whiteness was crucial in this period. They were white males, and all famous composers were white males in classical music at that time. And with their hard work, they created queer worlds in music, and they created a queer sound in music, which surprisingly became America's national sound. And now I would love to hear your comments and your questions.
Thank you. Could we start on the question and answer parts, or are we going?
And if anybody, I should take a look at the chat, because I haven't seen it late. Is there anything in the chat? Are you calling on them? Are you going to call on the questions? Or should I?
Yes, but feel free is raising hand. If you don't mind.
Please,
Can.
please.
Yes.
Hi. Oh, I'm sorry, Kibra. I guess I interrupt you.
No. I will give the word to you.
All right. I think that is not a strict question, but more like a comment on the issue. I think the gay composers becoming the natural voice of America is linked to knowing themselves. Because when we look at the cis hetero white men, they do not have any, generally, it can be a strict comment, I'm sorry for that, no instinct to know themselves very well, and generally they have no struggles from the society because they are already accepted, because in a sense they just created the society. And when a person just know oneself, himself or herself, or I may say that when we all trying to discover ourselves, and then we accomplish that, we can hear the nation, we can hear the society, we can just learn their struggles and their feelings. And then if we are doing art, we can just represent their thoughts and their feelings and their perspective of the world. I guess the reason can be that when I'm listening your amazing presentation, and that was really great, thank you so much. I just the thoughts that minded me like this way. I don't know. I'm not sure whether I'm right or wrong, but that's just a thought. Thank you so much, by the way, coming here and being with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm so honored and happy to be with you. So can I follow up with you?
Just think, yeah.
So you're saying that being able to love yourself is important,
Yes.
and that's easier for straight white men in society? Or I'm
Yes.
sorry, for straight white men, right?
Yes. I guess they do not need to love themselves because everyone loves they. So, but we as a woman or queer person or like LGBTI people and queers, we need to love ourselves at first if we want to society accept us. I think that's really important, and knowing ourselves is important in here.
I appreciate that comment, and I think that we do see in the history of these composers that they were able to love themselves because they created a queer world and a group, a tight-knit kind of queer family, right? And that allowed them to love themselves. At the same time, society did not love them. Society loved their music without knowing that it was created by gay composers. That fact only came out in the past 20 years. And, you know, their heyday had been 60 years earlier. So when they had their greatest success, it really depended on society not acknowledging that it came from gay composers, this music.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you for your great question.
Can I ask something?
Please.
Thank you for this great presentation and talk. And I thought that when I listened to you, I saw that a great and a big relationship between these composers. And I thought that what might be the result of this relationship on their own music? Could we say that if they haven't had such a relationship, what would have changed on their musical pieces?
So without these relations among them on all these different levels, the social, the musical, the sexual, would their music have been different, right? Is that what you're asking? Yeah, I absolutely believe that their music would have been different had they not interacted with each other and influenced each other in such ways as they did. I mean, Copland admitted that he learned a lot from Virgil Thompson. Oh, and let me talk a little bit about the history here. I mentioned Billy the Kid, which was an American ballet that Copland wrote in 1938. And it was kind of outrageous to have an American ballet. And Copland said, who would have ever thought of an American ballet? We don't have American ballets. But he wrote Billy the Kid, which is this cowboy ballet, and it made it very American to make it a cowboy ballet. Not at all like European ballets, right? We have to show how Americans can do ballet. But he got that idea, and he admitted this for his 1938 cowboy ballet from Virgil Thompson's 1937 ballet, which was called Filling Station. This was an outrageous, gay spectacle. Can you imagine? So a filling station, this is a gas station where you take your car to get gas. And at that time, there was no self-service. I don't know if you guys fill up your own cars but there were men in work clothes who would put the gas in your car, and there'd be a little badge on their shirt that said Bob or Johnny, and all the dancers on stage dancing on tow were dressed like that as filling station workers. It was so gay. It was and it was beautiful. And Copland said, Copland's breakthrough Americana work was Billy the Kid in 1938. It was inspired by Virgil Thompson's unfamous, almost unknown, really queer ballet called Filling Station. And Copland said, he has given us an important lesson in how to write American music. So we know that their music would not have been the same without the influence of each other. And I would say without this influence on all the levels, because, Virgil Thompson didn't write a straight ballet. Virgil Thompson's Filling Station was a very queer ballet. And then Copland found, a more hidden gay figure with the cowboy. The cowboy was a gay hero too, but straight people didn't know it. Straight people thought the cowboy was just super ultra butch. So, that passed. Thank you. Thank you for that question. Another question.
Yes, Olcay, Açık raised hands, and Olcay.
Hey, I've got a question about like how, making up the foundation of a sound of a nation is actually a pretty serious deal in my eyes. And I would say that this is inherently nationalistic. But like queer theory and queer thought reject nationalism in favor of individualism in a lot of areas.
Oops, I lost your sound.
Sorry. And I would call that like putting up the foundation for that nation's music is inherently national, and that queer theory is like inherently individualist. But like we could pretty easily say that these composers lived pretty queer lives and were part of a queer subculture, and that was their place in that time of that period. But like could be from this gather that either like queer thought has evolved over time to reject nationalism on a more serious way, or if that these people did not ever intend to be the voice of their nation, so to say, but instead were like the music that they composed were taken in by the heteronormative society that they lived in and were used not like without their consent, but without their expressed consent on this issue. And I was wondering about that. Thanks a lot.
That's a great question and very clearly articulated. Thank you. And it's complicated. So I would say, to your first question, is it the case that queer thought has evolved away from nationalism to reject nationalism? Absolutely, queer thought has evolved, and queer theory in particular has evolved in that direction. Your second question is it possible these composers never intended to be national symbols or to come up with a nationalist language? And I would say I can say yes to that too, especially in the case of Virgil Thompson. Virgil Thompson, wrote 2 operas with Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein's words were always ambiguous, and queer people in these operas, Four Saints and Three Acts and The Mother of Us All, the 2 operas that she composed 20 years apart with Virgil Thompson. Queer people heard in Gertrude Stein's words and saw in these operas queer scenarios. Straight people thought it was pleasant nonsense. It was just avant-garde nonsense. So Virgil Thompson really steered clear of these kinds of meanings. Aaron Copland, on the other hand, collaborated with other kinds of people, including the dancer and choreographer Martha Graham for Appalachian Spring. And there you had, lots of imagery that was embraced for nationalistic purposes. You had a young man and a woman dancing around in springtime and getting married. You had beautiful nature, the American prairie. These things were embraced for nationalist purposes, and Copland was okay with that. Again, Copland was gender normative and passed as straight. Thompson was super queer and actually quite frustrated that he wasn't taken seriously. He had a chapter in his own memoir called, or he used to say, "I never wanted to be a queer." The biography that a later biographer wrote of him had a chapter called "I never wanted to be queer." It is something that Virgil Thompson had said because it was very frustrating to him. It definitely held him back in his life and his career. That he was such a pansy. He couldn't walk into a room or open his mouth without everybody saying, "Oh my God, what a queen." So he didn't have that kind of muscle, that he should have, because he was brilliant. He was absolutely brilliant, but he wasn't taken seriously in the same way. So I guess my answer is, Oljoy, that some of these composers lent themselves and their work to nationalism more than others. All of them left the United States, though, and both Copland and Thompson spent years and years outside the United States and away from its homophobia. And so did Gertrude Stein. But, even as queer thought has evolved, I would point to how we have both things going on at the same time. There are certain moments when queer people still are very proud to be important to the nation. When Greg Louganis was winning gold medals for the United States in the 2000s, right? That was a very proud moment for a lot of LGBTQ people. And that was a nationalist embrace, right? So we always have both of these things going on at the same time. There's a tension. Can LGBTQ people be American? Or are they queer or are they American? As if those two things, right, oppose each other. And there's a way in which that's kept alive in queer theory's anti-nationalist impulses. Does that answer? Does that address?
That answers my question perfectly. Thanks a lot. But I also would like to add on that note that as a queer person who's protesting currently in that sort of a regime that is completely acceptable to be homophobic, and that you know, like the country's main fellows outright make up homophobic slurs to attack their people in Turkey. This is a situation that we have at hand here. And like to say that a couple of days ago, even under these circumstances, our friend had a court hearing because of them like walking toward our other campus with rainbow flags like attached to their backs and stuff. So they took them in, arrested them, and they had their hearing just the other day. And in the like outside of that courtroom, I gave an interview, which I thought was very important, because I held up a rainbow flag despite the police right next to me, like coming up to me and trying to make me put that rainbow flag away. I made that interview despite of all of that. And I was at that point very proud to be, one, queer, and two, like from the country of Turkey, like not in a nationalistic way, but in a way that wanted to endorse all of the Turkish or non-Turkish people, queer people who lived in Turkey. And at that point, I was super excited to be doing that, because I was being a voice to those who did not have a platform or could not speak up for themselves. And that made me proud to be both of those people, like having both of those identities at the same time. So I understand, like, despite being queer, nationalistic values or stuff that come pretty close to being nationalistic, I could say, coming close to our identities as human beings in some ways.
Wow. First of all, I'm glad they spoke to you. I'm glad they asked you for the interview. And I would, and I think I understand what you're saying about. I mean, there's a kind of a. Well, you said you were proud to be both Turkish and queer at that time, even as you are opposing the nation and its homophobic acts and policies. That makes sense to me. And so I think there's a way in which this term that I'm using here, queer world making, can kind of approach nation and yet be distinct from nation. And I think that this Gay Composers Circle gives a model for queer world making that can collectively uphold, right, its members and keep them going against the forces of homophobia, which may be social, which may be national, and official. At the same time as it, and so it, yeah, there's this nationalism at the same time as there's fighting against the nation. So it is complicated, and something that that Virgil Thompson said, and Gertrude Stein and other members of this Gay Composers Circle said it in their own words at different times too, was we had to leave America in order to see America more clearly. And even if you aren't outside Turkey, you may be inside Turkey, but you are outside Turkey, right? When you're in the margins in this way. And if you can understand yourself as having a clearer view on the nation because you are outside the nation, and if you can build queer worlds and collective power in which you all understand that together and sustain each other, we have a clearer view on this nation because there's a way in which we are outside this nation. and what we have to say. And as you said, you spoke up, and you felt you had something to say. It has to do with your outsider standing, and at the same time that you're an insider in a certain way. And that ambiguous and very uncomfortable positioning is a place you can get power from. But it takes a toll. It takes a toll. And so collective support has always seemed to me in the story of these gay composers absolutely key. There's no way to go back to your question, Enes. There's no way without that collectivity, without the bonds, that they could have done what they did. And I'm so happy that you all are doing this queer world making that you're doing in this group. That's the secret. That's the answer, I think. Oh, joy. Go ahead.
You, in the midst of your open lecture, you've also proposed a question about why you were talking about their social and romantic relationships with one another. And that is, I think, a very integral part of the queer experience, is that yeah, we have a small dating pool. That's something that actually we can use to our advantage, because like being queer and having the society suppress us in so many ways, like makes us come out at different ends. We either come out with like all of the things that we can do and all of the abilities that we have, and we learn to improvise and adapt under these circumstances and bring out the potential within us, or we just come out at the deep end where we have nothing, no family, no one to trust, no, like completely alone in this world. And at that point we have each other to rely on, because like if you're a queer person who's living in a very heteronormative and like homophobic society, you can sometimes only find that there are only queer people who would understand you, who know where you're coming from. And that in itself would, like, if you seek after that, if you go after the connection that you can have between queer people, that is something that we can effectively use to our advantage to fight back against the suppression that we face. That is something that we should seek. That's like collective soul, and that like even if it's just a one night stand that we're gonna have with another queer person that we just looked at and found hot, to put it in very basic words, that can give us something. That can give us that piece of closeness to another, that like straight people, especially with their huge taboos about their sex and like their sexual history and shit, they just can't experience that. So we actually have this secret power that you know, they just can't have when they can't experience it, unless they change their society to imitate ours in some way. And that is a stronghold we have over them, and which sounds a bit like funny if you think about it, but it just is the case here.
You said it. You said it so beautifully, about collective soul, about so to leave the sexuality and the sexual connections in the circle out of the story just guts the story, because you're absolutely right. This is our superpower. Queer love, which includes one night stands. It includes queer fucking. It's not just, sanitized, spiritual, pure queer love. it is our collective soul, and it's our superpower in all its forms. And its forms can be the one night stand. Its forms can be embodied in sound, and that's what these composers, they worked it on all those levels, and none of those all those levels were informed by each other. The music echoes with the sound of their hookups. It's in there. Absolutely. Yeah.
There's a question from one of our audience. Can I ask it? I have a question for you. Do you have any evidence that those composers were exchanging their content through their music, or the music they dedicated to each other, and in comments about their works? I'm also sending it to. Could you hear me?
Could you say it again?
I write it to you in the chat. I have a question for you. Do you have any evidence that these composers were exchanging their content through their music, or the music they dedicated to each other, and in comments about their works?
Yeah, great. So thank you very much for that question. This was a time of codes, secret codes, right? And so, yes, there was queer content, coded, hidden content that other queer listeners would pick up, and it would go right over the heads of non-queer listeners. Why? For safety, so that hostile listeners could not pin them down to queer meanings. But besides the safety of it, this created stronger in-group bonds. So, for example, Virgil Thompson wrote songs on texts by Oscar Wilde. He was writing operas on texts by Gertrude Stein. The straight world didn't acknowledge that Gertrude Stein, one of America's most famous avant-garde writers, they didn't acknowledge that she was a lesbian, but the queer world all knew that Gertrude Stein was a lesbian. So whenever Virgil Thompson wrote on texts by Gertrude Stein, he was exchanging queer content. There were little queer jokes, queer gags in there that only queer people picked up on. For example, that first opera, Four Saints in Three Acts, they wrote it about 16th century Spanish nuns and monks, Catholic nuns and monks. So that allowed them to put all the women together. The women all lived together and appeared on stage together, and all the men appeared only with other men together. They had an excuse because of how Catholic religious people lived. But of course, the queer people got it. Yeah, the boys are with the boys, the girls are with the girls. That's how life works. So there was queer content at various levels. And in fact, when Copeland, the most famous in this circle, when his career started to decline in the 1950s, it had to do with a couple of things. In the United States, after World War II, we had a Red Scare and we had a Cold War with Russia. And in that Red Scare, in fact, queers became more persecuted than communists. And so Copeland began to be persecuted. He was called up by the US Congress to answer for his communist sympathizing and attending certain group meetings, communist group meetings. But the fact that he was queer made it all the scarier, because queer people were coming under much more scrutiny at the time. And as his career declined in the 1950s, he wrote an opera, The Tenderland. And he did the rather unusual thing of making the main character in this opera a teenage girl. And that was one of the ways that the opera failed. And that was one of the places where he was too queer, I would say. In the same, he had always succeeded because he wasn't as queer as Virgil Thompson. But having a teenage girl as the main character, taking a teenage girl so seriously, as gay men often do. Look at Britney Spears' fan base, right? Gay men take teenage girls more seriously. And even in Copland's 1950s, that was the case. And it kind of, I think, contributed to the failure of this opera he had such great hopes for. It was one of his major works, and it was just a failure. So I would say that it was also because of the queerness kind of coming through in that very tense Cold War moment when the nation was so paranoid about queerness. But another thing, there are various other things, such as Virgil Thompson writing a number of songs, religious songs, on texts about shepherds. There are these ancient codes. My shepherd will supply my need. It sounds totally harmless and Christian with straight ears, but queer listeners saw more to it.
We had a final question, if you don't mind. If you
Please.
have time. Yes. The question is, what do you think the historiography that deliberately ignores the queer people in history? How should one deal with this kind of historiography? Sorry for my language. And I think it's a kind of don't have any role models, and it makes me curious also.
I would love the input of all of you on this. There's a dilemma here, right? There are contradictions here that I have touched upon but didn't get deeply into. But when you see the letter by Varese, where Copland's gayness automatically discredits him. Copland's the most successful composer in America at that time. And he's saying, well, sure, if you let men put their dick in your mouth, if you let men fuck you, then you own New York. Made no sense. How does that mean you own New York, please? But the very fact of his queerness, if I had been born, say 30 years earlier, if I wanted to be a queer friend to Copland, I would have shut my mouth and not talked about his queerness, right? I would have said what a genius he was. I would have talked about his music. Here's what's beautiful about it. Here's what's amazing in his music. And I would have kept my damn mouth shut about him being queer. Why? Because the times demanded it. What can you say? You can be a revolutionary. I could have been a revolutionary and written the same book that I actually did write, say 30 years earlier. What would have happened? I mean, you tell me. Because Copland deserves to be a gay role model, and gay kids deserve to grow up knowing that these composers were gay. We all know that. But what if you had tried to do it 30 years earlier, in, say, 1970 or something? Nobody would have read the book. I would have maybe not found a publisher for the book at all. And it's not fair, but in order to sing the praises and the glory of gay genius, I might have had to shut up about the gay part of the genius, right? Because different times in history call for different strategies. And we admire the revolutionaries, but for having impact, right? So I had an older musicology professor, and when I was a young professor and I told him, he said, "What are you working on?" I said, "I'm going to write a book about Copland." He was a 20th century musicologist himself, so he's very interested in Copland, had a lot of knowledge about Copland and all of these other composers. And he said, and this professor, by the way, was gay. And he was born in 1927. So imagine, he had studied with the same composition teacher in Paris, Nadia Boulanger, he himself had studied with. And so in the late 90s, when I told him, well, I'm going to write about Copland and this circle of gay composers and how their gayness related to their composing, he said, what does that have to do with anything? He hated it. He just hated it. He made it really clear that he hated the idea. And thank God I didn't take it personally, not for very long at least, because he had been my professor, and it hurt my feelings at first. He hated my book idea, but I thought about it and I actually found it historically informative, right? Because I thought, what if I were born in 1927? I was myself. I mean, he's pretty Queenie himself. And in the music world, in the classical music world, the butchest guys would be considered, would be seen as gay out in the regular world. The butchest people we knew, they didn't get very butch is what I'm trying to say, except among women like me. But among the men, things did not get butch in the classical music world. So this professor of mine was kind of Queenie himself, and he had lived through all this, and he had managed to win Fulbright Awards and this sort of thing, despite being gay himself, had had a big career, had published important books. And now I was about to out these people, and their very success had all depended on what? As George Chauncey, the US gay historian, said, keeping each other's secrets, being discreet. We depended on one another. Our gay collective love and trust meant that we didn't tell straight people because straight people would persecute us. And we knew it. So you see, I understood historiographically, I understood historically why my former professor hated my book idea, where I was going to talk about how these composers' gayness was actually central to their story as composers. He really hated the idea, and that made sense to me historically, because as we say, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. He had come up under a different regime, and it was hard for him to see that things were changing, that it could be beneficial actually to tell the story as a gay story, right? So ignoring queer people in historiography, I think at this point, at least in the United States, I would have to really wonder about any historian who's doing that, and I would question them. In other places in the world, there may be, more intricate strategies and tactics that are called for. And I would ask you guys, because I think that, as Oljoy was saying, being Turkish and being queer makes you an insider and an outsider, and you're dealing with oppressive conditions in Turkey that probably call for pretty intricate strategies of historiography as well as life, right?
Yes, I agree, obviously. And Olcay, you raised hand, and we can take a question briefly
Okay, I have a super quick question. It's like slightly related to the topic that we just discussed, and that is about how I'm going to look at it from a Western perspective, even though we can obviously see that sort of line of thought around here, but it's very prominent, has been very prominent recently in the US. And to that letter that you've shown in your presentation, we can see that this rhetoric was still strong in 90s, 1900s, and that is talking about queer people and how they came to the positions of power, despite the difficulties being queer has created, get persecuted because they think that they're taking advantage of the fact that they're queer. So like in modern days, we can hear claims like, oh, he just got that role because he's gay. Oh, he just is in that position because he's gay, or they're like non-binary, or that sort of thing. They're trying to be too inclusive, for God forbid that they put on anyone LGBTQ plus. People that live in current world are put on television, and that they are being criticized to have been put in there just for the sake of inclusivity. And that is like, I used to always think that this was like a newly made false observation, but it appears to me that this thing had existed at any time. And I find I was going to ask you why you thought that this was, because it kind of doesn't make sense that this sort of thing was said in the 1900s, because like nowadays we're more accepted and like more marginalized, but in a good way, so to say. Like currently, that's the position we hold in the Western hemisphere, and obviously not in here. But I was wondering why you thought that this was.
So the inclusivity thing, I think, was not, and I know exactly what you're talking about in terms of, there's this shared idea of, oh, he's taking advantage of his queerness. And in the current moment, that would be a comment on inclusivity. It's just going too far, right? In the 1940s, when Varese wrote his seething, hateful letter, he was drawing on a different kind of bias and hatred. I would say it's where male gayness intersects with misogyny, in the same way that women who succeeded in Hollywood were all assumed to be sleeping their way to the top. He was assuming the same thing about Copeland, even though I think Copeland was a top, not a bottom. And so he's saying, if you use your ass as a prick garage, and I'm like, oh, you're such a clueless straight man. Copeland wasn't even a bottom. But bottom shaming never goes out of style, unfortunately, right? But no, this is that place where gay maleness and misogyny intersect, and I think it's a really important intersection for us to know, and I would love for more gay discourse to acknowledge it. You must be sleeping your way to the top, right? And just the hypersexualization of gay people, which still continues today, that all they can think about once he knows you're gay, he can only think about your ass, right? He can only think about penetration of your anus. He just can't think of anything else. The hypersexualization.
Dear Hobbs, thank you again. This lovely lecture. I need to end lecture in the end as an last announcement. David Witten, Sarah Cahill, Adam Tendler, Swara Lessons, vocal will perform some pieces on YouTube, and you are invited. I appreciate to see you, all of you, and I wish everybody a happy Pride Month. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for your wonderful questions and comments and for your attention and this very exciting concert coming up in 35 minutes.
Yes.
There's the pride flag. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Goodbye for all. Thank you.
Evet, Serbest Yazın'ın Nadine ile olan açık dersini izledik. Gayet harika bir açık dersti. Serbest Yazın'a teşekkür ederiz. Birazdan konserlerle birlikte devam edeceğiz. Programda konuşulan, açık derste konuşulan kompozörlerin, bestecilerin bestelerini çeşitli sanatçılardan dinleyeceğiz. Saat 8'de görüşmek üzere. Kendinize iyi bakın.